Sometimes you need to make something for yourself. So I've got all of my bits. Today we're gonna be making some crazy Tzeentch horrors. It's gonna be fun. So I've never liked the Tzeentch pink horror models, at least the later ones. So I'm gonna make my own, but hobby is always more fun with a friend. So I'm gonna see if Murray is down to get involved in this hobby conversion challenge. Let's make some cool Chaos Demons just from bits and show you how you can make your own as well.
So in all the established imagery and even miniatures we have of horrors, they're all sort of on their own, just this massive stuff. The way they manifest or appear in the material world is something that's really, really cool. And I think that's what I want to focus on in this little coming out of maybe a person, kind of horrific. Like, it's scary enough Dracula emerging from the shadows or a monster coming out of a mirror, but if it's coming out of yourself, turning around and grinning at you, giggling, that's some nightmare fuel. So I'm gonna have a little play around with this. This is sort of just artistic freedom to do whatever we want. It's Tzeentch, that's the rules, there are none.
Or what you call guidelines.
So I'm just gonna dive straight into it. Let's go find some models. So since my idea is of having a demon emerging out of someone, that means I needed that someone. And luckily we had one of the Cadian command sprues. Sadly, it's not one of the new kits, but this one will do just fine. So I set up making a rudimentary human figure, trying to get a sort of zombie-ish pose. At this stage, I'm still not sure whether I want the human to be conscious and aware of what's happening to himself, or having been fully turned by now and is little more than a gibbering puppet for the gods. Now that we're up to this stage, it's time to put down the milliput. And I think it's pretty easy at this stage to get a bit of choice paralysis, and you don't really know where you're going to work on and what and how you'll start. So I'm just going to say stuff it and just throw the milliput on in a big ball. Sometimes I like to use a little bit of super glue to make sure it really adheres to that area so it doesn't pull off or something, but generally the overall tackiness will help it hold on. So once that's in place, I'm going to get my sculpting tool and just sort of really move it around, getting a good bit of water onto the tool to really liquefy some of the milliput. And I'm just going to make it so it's torn and twisted and warped straight off his body. And really, I'm just going to move it around and see what kind of cool shapes I can get out of this. What I do know is that I want a face emerging from this blob. This is going to be a lot less pink horror and more just body horror, I think. And I have these wailing banshees from one of the Age of Sigmar kits, which I love to use. So I'm going to clip that into shape and just shove it straight in and just mold it into the blob as well. Now that that part's sort of taken care of, I'm going to move on to some other body parts. I think I'm going to work on one of the feet, give it some really weird like tendril toes, and I think the hand. I've given it this sort of outstretched pointing hand because I know that I want to sculpt the hand into something else, sort of like one of those sock puppets that talk. I'm really thinking of the flames of Tzeentch and how their hands sort of distend into these open maws that vomit flame. And so that's the inspiration for what I'm going to do here. I'm going to stick some milliput onto his outstretched fingers and then plunge a sculpting tool into the middle of the blob and wiggle it around and make that big gaping maw. I want it to settle a little bit. I don't want it to move around after this next step, which is going to be using some isopropyl alcohol and a fairly gentle brush, and I'll use this to smooth over some of the milliput and get that really nice silky texture. However, at this stage I was looking at it and I thought he was just a bit lopsided, too lopsided for my liking. So I just grabbed one of the Banshee's hands from the kit and just shoved it into the side. It really helped to balance the miniature a bit more. It's a bit creepier, and it was so last minute that there's not even footage of it. I am a professional. Now all that's left to do is to let it set overnight. So my little sculpture is now dry, and I'm pretty happy with what I achieved. I'm going to be completely candid, not my best sculpt. But that was never the objective of this. This was just to break free and have fun sculpting something weird and different. Something that I haven't just done before. It's sort of exactly what I had in mind, like the mummy scream. That's really cool, and I'm gonna have a lot of fun painting this. This is a great little project. I can see David's working in the background there. So I'm excited to see what he's done as well.
So rapidly going through my bits, I did find a few pieces I could use as some legs, but I decided not to. If I'm going to make a demon entirely out of bits, it needs to be spare parts. I can't be hacking apart perfectly good miniatures to make it. So that means arms and lots of arms. And in particular, I'm liking the look of some of these House Escher arms. The swords have little gems in them, reminiscent of Tzeentchian daggers. And as always, I find myself going back to the Sylvaneth Dryad kit, which has heaps of these gnarly tree-like arms, which I think I'll be able to use. So without limbs, I've had an idea, and that idea is tentacles. Horrors of Tzeentch are described as constantly changing their form, being horrifying and difficult to behold. So it always struck me as odd that the baseline horror of Tzeentch always looked so similar to one another. So I'm going to use one of these old Necromunda pieces to create some verticality. I also grabbed some crumpled crumbled up corkboard and just made some rubble and ruin as if this is a destroyed outpost of some kind. I then needed a way to fasten my future Gribbly monster onto the base, so I grabbed a very grippy looking Sylvaneth hand, one that looked perfect as if he was holding onto and pulling himself past this piece of terrain. I glued that on and allowed that to dry. Now while that's drying, I need to mix up some Milliput so I can make the bulk of this horror of Tzeentch. So I just grabbed equal parts of the Milliput and I tried mixing it in the way I'd seen in Studson videos by throwing the two components in a ball onto the table. However, I didn't have any success with this, so I spent a few minutes mixing the Milliput by hand. So my gribbly little horror dude is sort of dry. The Milliput and glue is mostly in place, but this is going to be a fragile build. I'm going to glue on all the little tendrils, all the other little tendrils that I've made and start to make it look more horror-y, but I'm going to mix up green stuff with Milliput to make my Grilliput mix that I'm fond of and use that to do some detailed sculpting, start to bring in the gums, the mouth, the lips, the eyelids, and seamlessly work all these tentacles on, work in some of the other plastic components. But let's explore my little man, my little orb. He's like a Mike Wazowski. So there it is, the first step done, and at this stage it's mostly Milliput. I'm hoping it will all hold together. The gribbly blob of Tzeentch horror definitely feels like it's something I can picture, but it's hard to see what it will turn out like. While the first step of Milliput dry is basically giving me something to sculpt off, I have made a bunch of little tentacles and a bunch of spheres, and they'll be used to glue onto it later, sculpt in, and then also add eyeballs. That's what the spheres are for. So once this Milliput is dried, we'll come back to it and I'll start to make something that looks like more than just a silly armature blob. So we now have this interesting shape where we have a bunch of tentacles getting a nice sense of motion and homaging things like Screamers of Tzeentch and Horrors of Tzeentch. As I glue on all the spheres I made, it might look odd, but these are going to add a whole bunch of shape and form to the model that I'm really excited to sculpt over. So with my Grilliput mixed up, it was time for me to add some definition, and the first thing I needed to do was to blend all the tentacles in seamlessly onto the model. To do this, I added little lumps and just sculpted them following the flow of the tentacle into the head of this beast. Once this was done and I was pulling sculpting towards the front of the model, it became an organic and simple process to work in the eyes. To do this, I would grab small strips of putty and then I would lay one above one side of the eye and one on the bottom, sculpting them in to make eyelids. I also now included those House Escher sword arms, and I'm really surprised to see that my sculpting process took me away from a kit bash using bits and into more of a full freeform sculpt. I really like the vibe, but adding these elements of plastic kits gets a little bit of high fidelity into the model that I couldn't sculpt otherwise. With these eyes on, I also put a nice ring around one of the tentacles reminiscent of horrors and the jewelry they wear, and then I settled on focusing on the mouth. The mouth of the model I pushed in two gribbly looking gums running top to bottom, and then I clipped tips off the numerous excessive dryad bits that I have and squished them into the putty to create teeth. As a finishing touch, I created a long tongue jutting out from that horrible orifice. With all these pieces sculpted on, I can put this aside to dry, and I have to say I'm really happy with this maddening little blob.
Welcome to my airbrushing setup. This will be the workstation for the next 5 minutes. I'm gonna start with black, go to gray, and then I'm gonna start playing with colors, I think. Huh. Let's go. Okay, so upon leaping into painting this model, my first thoughts are all about theme and atmosphere. I want to really ground this in reality and then make it weird and warped, as of course this is the nature of the warp. So I want to get some really nice textures happening first. I want to get some nice leathers on his boot, on his clothes, and particularly the skin of his head. If I can get that looking really nice and believable, it'll make the Eldritch horror even more concerning and weird. I'm going to start off by building up murky tones over the entire model, mixing in browns, reds, and greens to make this basically going to be a weird grey, which will make this really moody, grim, dark theme. And I'll simply start adding colours to this mix to create all the different materials, the fatigues, the leathers, the skin, the armour, and any of the other straps and little bits upon him. I'm going to go for a more recognisable Cadian tone, as since starting with something that's easily recognisable will make warping it even more convincing. The influence of the warp is to start leading those colours down into what I've sculpted. So let's take the green armour for example. I'm going to keep going with the brush, stretching that down into what I've sculpted, as if the the really solid flak armor is just starting to melt and drip. Now this is where the added bonus of having base coated the entire model in one color comes in handy. Because this will help harmonize across all the colors I've already established, I can just start adding purples and blues into the mix and start painting the horror itself. When it comes to painting the horror, I'm just going to go for really strong and vibrant colors, basically not obey any rules. I'm just going to go wild and paint this real acid trip of a monster on the side of him, as I really want the weirdness of this monster to counteract the grounded realism of the human himself. One of the final stages of painting this model will be completing this horrific visage that I've converted, that huge howling jaw that's just distending, and I'm going to paint tiny specks of white making glowing eyes deep into the now cavernous pits that were his eyes. This is going to create a really haunting and creepy look. Final step is to take a pass around the entire model. If some parts just aren't popping out enough, I'm going to go in for an extra highlight just to make it really stand out and grab your attention. This will include extra bounce lights off the top of the human's scalp, the teeth of the horror bursting out of his chest, and also the Eldritch maw on the end of his hand. Then, with a little addition of basing texture, I hope you've really enjoyed my little dabble into something weird and wonderful, and I cannot wait to see how Dave's turns out.
With everything set, I can settle into painting. And for a cool Tzeentch Changer of Ways paint job, I want to have some really smooth, creamy blends. The way I'm going to do that is airbrushing on a whole bunch of glazes and washes to get my color, which means starting from a white undertone. I use Vallejo Gray aerosol to spray the model, and then a Vallejo White as a top coat, basically zenithaling it to get a little bit of lighting into the model. Then, because I want a really shiny, high specular reflection, bubblegum pink sort of coloration, I grabbed a flat white and painted these really obvious circles on the model, almost comic book style on all of the highlight points. Now, when I glaze over these are going to be tinted in the colors of the flesh, but they will also serve as areas that I can add another hand-painted specular highlight on towards the end. With the aerosols dry, I actually started with some purples and blues, spraying them into some of the lower areas, the recesses, the creases between the tentacles and around the mouth and eyes to give a whole bunch of color variation. Once these had dried and settled, it was time to come across the whole model with that nice pink. So to paint the skin, I used a mix of Scale 75's Instant Alchemy range, as well as some of Broken Anvil's paints mixed down with some airbrush thinner. With these colors down as my foundations, I then came in with Broken Anvil's beautiful pink and started to work up on those highlights, highlighting a nice white on the very top surfaces. I used Druchii Violet in thin glazes to build a bunch of shadow in the lower recesses of this beastie, and I basically worked back and forth between these two techniques until I got something I was happy with. Once this was done, I could select a few areas like the eyes to lavish a bit of detail on, and one of the things I enjoyed doing here was making sure all the eyes had wildly different colors, something unique to a horror of Tzeentch. In the mouth, I used khakis with a nice highlight on the teeth, and I also used some Carroburg Crimson washes to bring a bit of fleshiness into that area. There was a gold band and the swords, which I just used some metallic paints, Scale 75 golds in particular, and just lead belcher with a chainmail highlight for the silver. These areas got a sepia wash before I moved on to the front of the model. I wanted to see if I could get some extra sheen, so I tried some UV resin in the eyes, and I think it worked out pretty well. As well as this, I used just a little bit of our stringy glue for some saliva, and with that, the horror up top was finished. For the base, I didn't want to detract any attention from the vivid and vibrant horror, so I went for a really grungy battlefield look, stippling on a series of purples on the rock and rubble just to tie in with the Changer of Ways color palette, then using some mid browns and mottled browns for all of the machinery. I picked out a few details before applying some weathering pigment to the base to tie it all together. And with those steps complete, the model is finished and ready to show off for reveals. We'd like to give a massive thank you to all of our patrons who support us to make 2 videos a week. Without you, it really wouldn't be possible. So if you'd like to consider supporting Tabletop Time and help us to keep making these videos, we now have a weekly update behind the scenes vlog every Monday going out on the Patreon, as well as monthly mini review to keep you in the loop. So links are in the description, and thanks for checking that out.
Hours later.
Tzeentch! Tzeentch! That was a cool video, Murray.
Nice.
Oh, look, I want to change the ways of all this smoke in front of me. If you like this video, consider hitting like and subscribe. It was fun to just do something for fun. And hey, I'm really happy getting to play around with sculpting some more.
Yeah, we got to just make something insane and wild, which was awesome.
Yeah. So see you in the next video for something completely different.
See you later.